9:39, Tony Messenger is via Skype from the world headquarters of STLtoday.com. John Deal, Speaker of the House, is here in studio, and Jane Duker, Chief of Staff of Governor Holden. Jane, you'll take the lead on this story, and that is Governor Blunt earlier with the EPA has now said that they are going to go back and drill 80-foot holes into the ground, into the trench, to find out exactly where the nuclear waste is within the landfill, because now there is nuclear waste somewhere in the burning landfill. They need to find out where. The stench is over the top awful. I asked Governor Blunt earlier today his thoughts on the Bridgeton landfill burning next to the nuclear waste site. Here's what Senator Blunt said.
People that bought property in Bridgeton bought property in most cases after this situation was known and was there. Now, whether they knew it or not is different than whether they could have known it or not. And the taxpayers of America don't necessarily have to come in and make an investment right for people in Bridgeton. But if this is going to impact groundwater, if it's going to have an impact on health and safety, I'm going to insist the federal government take care of it. If all that we're talking about here is enhancing a property value beyond what your value was when you bought the property, that's a different discussion.
Jane Duker, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm very glad to hear that the senator believes that if this is a health issue, that the federal government, he's going to insist that the federal government pick it up. And while I don't generally disagree with the fact that if this is solely an economic issue, the taxpayers ought not pay the tab, the idea that the EPA is still trying to figure out how close the nuclear waste is to the burning landfill makes it pretty unlikely that, everyday homeowners had real full knowledge of what is going on here. And so to say that, okay, they knew there was a landfill, well, that's one thing. But to know that the landfill was going to meet the nuclear waste and there was going to be a fire, to charge taxpayers or at least the residents of Bridgeton with that kind of knowledge when EPA doesn't even know what's on their hands is kind of a joke. So while I agree, generally with his comments that, if it's solely an economic issue, that's a private thing and that the private company should compensate if they're liable. But I think the likelihood that this is a solely an economic issue is slim to nil.
There's also a couple of things here in terms of facts. The fire started burning 2 years ago.
Correct.
So you could have bought a house over there 3 years ago next to a landfill, next to a nuclear site, and it didn't stink. And then all of a sudden it starts burning. Should the buyer know or possibly guess that, hey, maybe this waste dump is going to start catching on fire and I won't be able to go outside because it stinks?
I mean, and this is the other thing. There were similar sites to this all over the country, and every one of them has been cleaned up but Bridgeton. So the idea that now the federal government says this may be different, even though this is, Malincrot and, how many years back did this all happen? All the other sites have been cleaned up.
It was moved to Bridgeton.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, and this is the only one that hasn't been abated. And so, I think the argument that this is something that the federal government is going to sort of get out of is probably slim to nil, and they shouldn't.
Well, I've always found Senator Blunt to be very candid.
Right.
And very careful in his work.
Yes, he was.
And I've just heard this, but what I heard is a little bit different from what you're talking about.
Go ahead.
Okay. What he said was, if this is a question of enhanced property values over what people paid for their property,
you're right. That's a private issue.
It's something that the federal government ought not to be involved in.
Correct.
He didn't say about diminution of value.
Right.
He said
enhanced.
Right. He said if there are claims out there that my property should be worth more than what I bought it for,
right,
that's not something we're going to. I absolutely agree with.
And I do too, actually.
So actually his statement was correct.
Right.
It was
the standard.
right on point.
Right.
Right. And there's a lot going on here. And also from what I understand is now that the EPA is going to be drilling these new holes, that's going to create more stench. The smell is a state issue, not a federal issue. The federal issue is the EPA finding out where the nuclear waste is.
And where it's going.
And there are people who already think right now that it's seeping into the groundwater. And Jane's point that they've moved other things that have been exactly like this means why is this so special that they want to test it 800 times, but they've moved all the other ones?
Right. And unfortunately, EPA is not, a model of efficiency on this stuff, which is
Matt,
unfortunate.
Senator Blunt said
as
well that he's not necessarily a big fan of the EPA.
Right. Well, and my Democratic credentials, I'm an environmentalist, but I'm not always a big fan about how EPA gets this stuff done. If there's a problem, get in and get it over with.
AKA tree hugger. Tony Messenger, you want to chime in on this?
Well, the most interesting word in Senator Blunt's statement is if.
Right.
It's a question as to whether or not there is an actual health hazard. And I don't think we know for sure yet what the health hazard is. I think we have to keep testing, and where the private company has failed and where DNR has failed here in the state and where EPA has failed federally is that they haven't pushed hard enough for the most stringent sort of testing to get the most information we can so we know where the waste is, so we know whether the smoldering is coming anywhere near the waste, so that we know if stuff's in groundwater. We don't know that there's a health hazard. We sure as heck can use our common sense to assume that it sure sounds like there's going to be at some point, and if so, it's going to cost taxpayers millions and billions of dollars to clean that thing up. I think ultimately that's what's going to happen.
That's Tony Messenger, John Deal, Jane Duker. I want to try and get to Chris Christie. We'll save some time for that next on KTRS.